The Ottoman Empire finds itself in the beginning stages of its collapse in Victoria III, with the recent shrinking of its borders bringing about fear that the once illustrious Sublime Porte might never recover. Sultan Mahmud II has taken it upon himself to reorganize the empire so that it can face the new challenges being flung its way. This reorganization is known as Tanzimat and is central to the Ottoman Empire's opening in Victoria III. Today we actually have a very particular goal for our Victoria III playthrough, and that is to get the Healthy Man of Europe achievement. It's pretty simple. It just asks that we play as the Ottomans and get a max level healthcare institution and become the #1 great power. I've done this achievement before on old patches, but Victoria III has changed quite a bit since then, so I'm going to show you some new strategies to stabilize the Ottoman Empire. Along the way we'll be reorienting our empire away from an imperial monarchy towards a nationalistic republic, but without all the historical consequences for our non-Turkish population. Let's get into it. The goals of Tanzimat are to modernize the Ottoman Empire, and that goal is quite in line with my own goals. Failing the Tanzimat sees the Ottomans demoted to an unrecognized power and sees them pretty much screwed on account of it, so it's in our best interest to follow through. We need to complete 4 Tanzimat entries to complete the Tanzimat broadly. 2 of them are basically free, in the sense that you'll be pursuing them without even realizing it. To suppress separatism, all it takes is not maxing out your taxes. You're very unlikely to generate enough radicals that a secession will happen as long as you're keeping taxes relatively reasonable. Bureaucratic reform is also one which you'll be pursuing almost out of necessity, as the Ottomans will want to get off of serfdom and off of traditionalism no matter what path we have in mind. Alongside that, changing tax laws and swapping to something like appointed bureaucrats are just good moves in general. For that reason, bureaucratic reform is also pretty much free. Even army modernization is relatively easy, since we just need some tech and then we upgrade our army and it's done. Again, this is something you'll be doing whether motivated by Tanzimat or not. That's 2 or 3 mostly free reforms. The others we'll go for relate to Egypt. In patch 1.8, it's significantly easier to defeat Egypt on account of them already being your subject. There are some strategies which revolve around attacking a North African miner so that Egypt tries to defend them, at which point you can fight them without any foreign interference. However, I'm not using that strategy just because I find it inconsistent. Instead, I'll be doing a more traditional play later. For now, let's look at opening moves. I'm going to put down a bunch of education decrees, since we don't have a lot of literacy anywhere in the empire, and I'll be focusing my construction in Doğu Trakya because there's iron there and a moderate number of peasants. States like Konya and Ankara have more pops, but not as many local resources, so we're better off doing some opium farming there probably. For now, iron mines and tool workshops take precedence though. For my first play, I decided to lower Tunis's autonomy. And it's mostly because it's just easy to get away with. Usually no one intervenes, and in theory, if Egypt does, you can do the aforementioned African miner strategy, but even more easily in a way. In my game though, no one came to Tunis's aid, and they backed down. Afterwards, I went for the classic opium war strategy, but not for multiculturalism. In the past 2 guides, I've shown off how to get a Han nationalist movement that can help you get multiculturalism, but in this run, just for variety's sake, I won't be doing that. Instead, we're grabbing a treaty port and letting Britain grab one too, so they'll do all the work. I'll also be liberating UA, because that will invalidate Britain's treaty port, and I'll be grabbing war operations to boost my economy. I want to invalidate their treaty port so they don't have to compete with me for opium sales. I got a little creative too, and decided to transfer Korea. In terms of specifically why, it's because I'm hoping that some Korean pops might migrate over to Turkey in the future, since Turkey has a distinct issue with population. You'll find that, assuming you don't mismanage your economy, you'll end up running out of peasants to employ pretty fast. Some imported Korean workers could help solve that issue, but it's totally luck-based in determining whether or not they'll migrate over via cultural communities. I activated corn laws shortly after the Opium War began. It's very easy to do by just setting all your farms to produce figs, which will spike the price of grain. Now we just wait for a modern conservative, and then we can end serfdom and get a new economy pretty fast. I got my modern conservative in December of 1836, but we're hitting a slight snag. We can't put the market liberal in charge unless his movement is pressuring the landowners. The modernization movement is pretty weak in our nation, but if I take off some consumption taxes, then I can bolster the movement and hopefully get just enough support that the landowners can accept a new leader. The Opium War came to an end in July of 1837, which means I've got a whole lot of income right now, and I've got a treaty port in Suzhou that I can use to force a whole lot of opium. I'm going to use Anatolia as an opium farming region because it has lots of peasants and little education. Later on in this run, we'll transition towards more of a manufacturing economy, but for now, we could use some profitable industries, and although opium is run by aristocrats who don't tend to invest much, we can use a company to change out the aristocrat ownership with capitalists. Special note here, I'm also building up Egypt's opium, and that's explicitly to increase their economic dependence on me so I can control their liberty desire later on. In October of 1837, the modernist movement had enough support that I can put the market liberal Mustafa Koshalai in charge. He supports an end to serfdom, and I'll be using homesteading. I want homesteading in the case of the Ottomans because it will help with keeping the standard of living just a little bit higher. If the farmers personally own some of their farms, they'll have more money and can live better lives than if their profits aren't being siphoned off by aristocrats. It's also nice because it empowers the rural folks lately who prefer better tax models compared to landowners. Homesteading quickly came to law in December of 1838, and I of course immediately got to passing laissez-faire. That free company slot is pretty important to my opium strategy. In terms of diplomacy, by the way, I'm mostly improving relations with my subjects and with Britain, because the British are probably the best friends we could ask for in case any great powers like Russia come after us. Russia tends to be quite aggressive against the Ottomans, and sometimes Britain can help bail you out. In this run though, Britain wouldn't end up being very useful, and I'd have to handle the Russians on my own mostly. We'll get there when we get there. I passed laissez-faire in August of 1840, and now all I've got left to fix up are my tax laws and my bureaucrat laws. I'll be starting with appointed bureaucrats because it'll increase our tax capacity. Elected bureaucrats becomes better once you have a lot of institutions, but right now we have basically none, so appointed is better. To make some use of my infamy, I invaded some Arab countries like Nejd and Jabal Shamar. Part of me was hoping Egypt would try and defend them, but they didn't. The reason I fear attacking Egypt isn't necessarily because Egypt itself can beat me. They can't. But it's that nations like Russia might intervene. Fighting Russia and Egypt at the same time is probably a death sentence, but I can handle one of them at a time. Speaking of which, shortly after conquering Jabal Shamar, Russia just straight up attacked me. This is sort of bad, sort of good. I'd say overall it's a bad thing to be attacked like this, but we can get something out of it and win. It's actually not at all very hard to beat Russia in Victoria 3. It just takes a little bit of maneuvering. I'm going to be conquering Armenia, Azerbaijan, and liberating Ukraine, Georgia, and the Don Cossack hosts during this war, alongside some war operations of course. I'm pulling up the army in defensive positions along the front, but keeping one army back in case of naval invasions. It might sound like my demands are pretty heavy here, and it's unlikely that we can enforce them, but I'm going to fight this war a couple different ways to show how you can beat Russia. The last method I show is by far the best one. I'm sort of acting like I intentionally showed off all these different ways to fight, but the truth is I was stubborn and didn't want to resort to cheap tactics to win without at least trying to genuinely defeat Russia. Their first strategy for fighting Russia is to just sit on defensive and hope you can outdo them on manpower. The distinct advantage you have as a player is that you can use conscription decrees that the AI tends to just not even think of doing. Ultimately, the Russians will almost certainly outlast you in manpower, and economically speaking, you'll be shooting yourself in the foot with the cost of all these guns and bullets. You can eventually win, probably with enough dedication, but I wouldn't recommend it. To help distract from the front, you can send naval invasions into places like Ukraine, which will drag Russians off the front. Now, the true way to beat Russia is similar to this strategy, but it's just in a different location. Invading Ukraine will generally see the Russian army come back and reclaim it pretty fast, because the AI doesn't like when its incorporated states are occupied. I didn't show it in this run, but if you invade states like Kamchatka or Chukotka, off in the far east, the Russians probably won't even respond until you get far west enough that you start hitting some incorporated states. We can take advantage of that behavior to get to St. Petersburg pretty easily. After a few distraction invasions into Ukraine and some smart invasions to Bessarabia and Georgia, I've actually gained some ground on the Russians, which goes to show you can win using this method, but it won't work well if you've got war goals as far north as liberating Ukraine. If my only war goal was to conquer Armenia or something, this would be a pretty good strategy. While working on this war, I'm passing racial segregation, by the way. Most of the pops in our nation are either European or Middle Eastern. We'll always have trouble tolerating the Europeans, but the Middle Easterners we can definitely get along with well. Turkish is an interesting culture in Victoria 3, in that it gets Middle Eastern heritage, which aligns it with the Arabs and Persians in terms of race, but its language trait is Turkic, which is only shared with the Tatars and Tuvans. That means it can be pretty tough to get good acceptance, as even the Azeris don't have Turkic language. Sadly, we can never change our primary culture in-game, but in theory, we'd much prefer to have something with the Arab or Iranian-Turanian trait, so we could be more tolerant. Oh well, at least we'll occasionally get some mass migrations of Tatars here and there. Anyway, I got fed up with the stalemate front against Russia, as by now they're running out of manpower, but my men aren't good enough to reasonably push despite the Russian manpower issue, so I'm just going to play my trump card. In March of 1846, yes, this war has been going on that long, I invaded the Kola Peninsula after having landed in Venetia earlier. The reason I landed there first was as a distraction, as moving through the Siberian wastes is quite slow for an army. It might seem like they're closer to Kola, and they are closer, but the actual movement from Russia's Arctic north to Kola is quite slow compared to moving up from Ukraine. Indeed, the soldiers in the far north are at first not even going to do anything to stop me, because these states are unincorporated. You can freely invade from Kola to Karelia without any hassle, because these states are unincorporated, but once you get to Karelia, you'll have a front right on St. Petersburg, at which point Russia will of course come for you. If you use an army composed of half cavalry and use the rapid advance tactic though, you can extremely quickly occupy a ton of states. Rapid advance is a tactic you unlock if, I think, more than 40% of your army is composed of cavalry. I think it's 40%, could be 30%, but usually with this strategy you will use 50% cavalry anyway, since it's the most you can get away with without taking penalties. Each cavalry unit increases occupation, while rapid advance on each general increases how many battles you can fight at a time. I barely managed to get to St. Petersburg until the Russians arrived. Obviously, they can easily kick me out, but while their capital is occupied, they're more likely to give up. I end up taking all my war goals except for the Don Cossack liberation. I was getting close to bankruptcy from this war, so I chose to just end it. Had I done this strategy much earlier, we could have been done real quick, but it's okay. It just makes me look more GIGACHAD and I can throw the war and still come out on top. It's 1846, and we've defeated Russia pretty nicely, cutting them off from Persia and releasing one of their best regions. During that war, I had passed racial segregation, and now I'm working on per capita taxation, which, once it passes, will complete my bureaucratic reform journal. I know it's a bit late, by the way, but I got the stock market tech in March of 1847, which is nice because it increases the market access price impact, also known as MAPI for short. MAPI is essentially money deletion. I talk about it in most videos, but a quick explanation, in case people don't get it, is that a good has a price. Let's say it's £5. When that good is sold, the business selling it makes £5 on it, and the pop or business or trade route buying that good pays £5 plus a bonus cost based on MAPI. If the MAPI in Doğu Trakya is, let's say, 80%, then the price paid for that good will be 5 plus 20% extra that is paid to no one. That means the pop is paying £6 for a good, so that the business can make £5 of income. Where did that extra £1 go? It's gone. It's deleted. No one makes that money. It's just lost to the ether, similarly to tax waste. Remember, tax waste still taxes your pops. The money just goes nowhere. For that reason, MAPI is very important, because it just rips money out of the economy in the most unproductive way possible, hence why stock exchange is really nice. I passed my per capita taxation law in August of 1848, which saw my first Tanzimat journal completed. By fixing up the bureaucracy, we've significantly improved the government budget, which has given me the confidence to go after Egypt. Because of how interests work, I can basically 1v1 Egypt. While many nations might have interests in Arabia, most don't have an interest in the Nile, and so because of that, my reduced autonomy play will involve pretty much just me in Egypt. In order to fulfill my Tanzimat journals, I'll be taking all my claims in Syria, which will complete one Tanzimat journal. The next Tanzimat journal requires you to reduce Egypt's autonomy, which is something I'm also doing in this war, so we're getting 2 for 1 in this war. In theory, you'd actually want to do this move after researching colonialism, since it reduces the infamy gained when attacking unrecognized powers, which Egypt is. But it's alright, we don't plan to go too crazy on infamy as the Ottomans in general, so we can afford some hefty early infamy. Egypt is easily defeated in a one-on-one against an Ottoman Empire run by a player, especially because I'm using the better mobilization options to increase my army's attack and defense. In August of 1849, they were capitulated, and I completed 2 Tanzimat journals in one. Now I just need to wait a little bit longer for the suppressed separatism journal entry while I pass legacy slavery. It's much easier to move from legacy slavery to banning slavery, so we're getting towards the end of slavery one step at a time. In January of 1851, we've completed our 4th Tanzimat journal, which ends the Sick Man of Europe journal entry with success, and it gives us some claims on the Balkans that we might use later. By this time, I've become the 3rd great power with 20 million GDP and a pretty healthy budget. I'm paying off the cost of the Russian war right now, and then I'll focus on increasing construction. For now though, we've reorganized the empire and escaped the awful modifiers from the Tanzimat, and now we can focus on a relatively normal game of Victoria 3. The achievement we're going for is called the Healthy Man of Europe, and it requires us to become the #1 great power and to max out our healthcare institution. The biggest roadblock to that achievement, funnily enough, is how long it takes to get the antibiotics tech, which is a tier 5 tech. You can't max out your healthcare without that tech. Getting first place great power can be a bit bothersome, but because of the time it takes to reach antibiotics, you have a lot of time to do so. This means we can get a little creative, and I have in mind a proper Turkish republic, which we'll achieve through liberalization. I'll be working towards liberalization with some voting laws and bans on slavery later, but for now, I'm grabbing the advanced research mandate in October of 1852 to help get to antibiotics faster. I'm also spamming out universities around the same time. Normally, I'd focus my efforts on construction, but with the Ottomans, your population is low enough that if you spam out construction, you might just see yourself running out of pops, and in this particular run, research is pretty important. As of November of 1855, I've almost got the pharmaceuticals research, and this is important because it unlocks public healthcare. It's actually quite easy to pass because the religious folk will approve a move from no healthcare to public healthcare. In April of 1857, I grabbed the second level of vassalization, which gives me a pretty nice income boost, although technically I'd have been wiser to get the advanced research mandate for the purpose of specifically this achievement. With my debts paid off and my balance in a healthy state, I went after Persia. The nice thing about Persia is that as a protectorate, they can still declare wars and pursue their own goals, which they often will, so it's quite wise to protectorate them and let them take the infamy on for conquering further east. I got very lucky in that Persia just backed down in this war. All it took was raising a bit too much of an army and threatening to extract war operations. If they don't back down to you, you should be able to steamroll them pretty easily, and Russia might get involved, but if they do, focus on defending against them first till they capitulate, and then focus on Persia. In February of 1860, I got my second company, which was Eastern Thrace Metals. This is also a good opportunity to look at my opium and tea company, which you can see there has quite a few levels. This is one of my favorite early game reinvestment boosts, is to use laissez-faire with a company on some kind of highly profitable plantation. You can use it on cotton too, which is often also very profitable, as well as stuff like tobacco or even wine, but of course opium is up there in terms of profits, so it's the best pick. I'm making such huge opium profits thanks to my massive trade route with Qing. We're using almost 3,000 convoys to send in 2,250 units of opium there. I got to work passing public healthcare soon after, using the religious folk as my support to do so. You'll see I'm also suppressing the pro-slavery movement in the hopes that I can get them below 5% support. Below 5%, they usually can't start an actual revolution. The rules are a bit weird though. From what I understand, a movement below 5% can't become revolutionary, but if a movement is already revolutionary, it will stay revolutionary even if its support goes down. Regardless, suppressing them will reduce the stall chance that'll add to my attempts to ban slavery later down the line. Here's Persia going after Kalat all on their own, by the way. It's a good idea to help them complete their conquests by joining in as their overlord and then adding some more goals yourself. Pro tip about trade routes, by the way, let's check back in on my opium route. We see that it's not increasing in level, despite being profitable, and that's because were it to go from level 46 to 47, it would reduce the productivity on the route too much, and that's because I'm charging tariffs on the opium using mercantilism. Let's say I want to export more opium. Well, all I have to do is encourage exports, which gets rid of any tariff on my end. It's going to cost me about £2,000 of government revenue, but in return, I'll make every opium plantation in my nation more profitable since they'll be able to export more. If we check again, we can see that now the trade route is upgrading. The best way to upgrade a route is of course to just produce more of that good so that your market's price will be lower. Every route will essentially try to create an equilibrium between the prices of each market's good so that it's profitable. It wouldn't make sense to sell opium to China if the price in China were lower than in the Ottoman market. You'll notice though that the price never does truly equalize, and that's mostly down to the way routes are divided. Most routes will sell 5 units per level, plus an economy of scale bonus based on the size of the route, which I believe comes out to an extra 0.25 multiplier per trade route level, and then you might add modifiers like free trade that increases the size of the routes. Here's a convenient picture of an opium trade route later in the game that displays how that's calculated. Basically, there are no fractional trade route levels, so maybe I could export a little bit more opium to perfectly balance the price, but the number of units that would be sold if we went up one more level would lead to the Ottoman price being higher than the Qing price, and so the route won't upgrade. When it comes to determining what to do with tariffs, it's about figuring out what matters more to you, more profitable businesses or a boost to the government income. It's my opinion that in most cases, more profitable business is better because it lets those businesses employ more people and make bigger dividends for your capitalists who will just reinvest that money anyway. That being said, tariffs can be useful for managing trade routes which other people are putting on you. For example, if you're playing Russia and everyone is importing your wood, but you want that wood for your construction sectors, it makes a lot of sense to heavily tariff wood exports. Enough nerding out about trade routes though. I got public healthcare in February of 1862, and next I'm getting public schools. If we can increase literacy, we can increase research speed, which will help us get to antibiotics. Aside from fulfilling the needs of the challenge, having healthcare is great because it raises your standard of living across the board, and with higher standards of living, you can afford to charge higher taxes without causing as much radicalism. Keep in mind that education raises the expected minimum on standards of living, by the way, so if you intend to use your healthcare to justify higher taxes, don't then also pass education reforms that will see your pops wanting a higher average standard of living. Public schools passed quite easily in December of 1863, and I'll be needing more bureaucracy to level this stuff up. For now though, we can see that I can get a Tier 2 society tech every 2 years or so, which is pretty good. Tech costs increase massively between tiers, but then each tech you have of a previous tier reduces the cost. That's basically how ahead of time penalties work in Victoria 3. The advanced research mandate makes each level of education institution decrease that penalty, which will help us rush for antibiotics. For my third company, which I unlocked in August of 1864, I grabbed a rice company in Baghdad, but to be honest, this wasn't wise. Making highly profitable farms is really difficult because, generally speaking, if grain is expensive enough to make the company profitable, then your people won't be very happy. You could, in theory, make this work by making a big grocery industry that buys up the grain while your pops can instead buy the cheaper groceries, but lower SOL pops aren't able to buy groceries, so you'd have to do that in a nation like Belgium or something, where the population is a bit lower and more concentrated. In a market like mine, almost all the pops are eating grain right from the farm and can't afford to get fancy groceries. I took the company because I was thinking of building up a big rice field in Baghdad where the throughput was high, and then putting a migration decree there to try and Turkify Baghdad for the memes. But the problem is that we just don't have the ability to generate immense standards of living such that we could attract enough pops to Baghdad to reasonably do this. If I were to start making a ton of jobs there and really invest everything into subsidizing and building up Baghdad, you might be able to. If you're interested in more about migration, check out my United States video where I put 100 million pops into New York using some migration maxing techniques. Anyway, this chapter is called Liberalization, so it's about time that we liberalize. We're going to implement wealth voting, which will empower my industrialists and intelligentsia a lot. You'd think that if I want a republic going, I'd want to put in universal or census suffrage, but actually, those voting laws would likely see my rural folk and conservative parties gaining power, as most of our pops are pretty reactionary, broadly speaking. We need the progressive and radically minded academics and capitalists to get in power in order to become a republic. If we can have a massively powerful industrialist interest group and get a Republican in charge, then swapping to a republic won't be very hard at all. I passed wealth voting in June of 1866, and we can see that even with wealth voting, the conservatives still just barely have a plurality of the votes, although my industrialists aren't too far behind them. Since it seems like the dreams of a republic might be a bit of a ways away, I decided to reconquer Greece. When we completed Tanzimat, we got claims to Greece, which we'll use to conquer them for pretty low infamy. They are part of the Russian power bloc, so it's quite likely that Russia will defend them, but by this point, I'm much stronger than before and shouldn't struggle with Russia, especially because I can just keep my war goals focused on Greece and win there rather than focus on the Russians. That's what I was planning, but then the Greeks got Russian support in return for becoming a protectorate. A subject will never capitulate while their overlord is in the war, so I'll have to deal with Russia after all. One way to deal with Russia pretty easily, if you've already freed Ukraine, is to set war operations and attack Bessarabia. The Russians don't have enough convoys to feel confident stationing a big army there, so you can just naval invade that state pretty easily. Since I'm having to fight Russia anyway, I'll be adding Dobruja and Bessarabia as war goals. These states aren't hugely important, but it'll make it so that if Russia and I fight again, there'll be only one front in the Caucasus to deal with. The Greece front is actually pretty tough because Russia is putting most of their army there, but it's quite easy to just naval invade Athens and then naval invade Achaia until the whole country is occupied. Don't forget the Aegean Islands, by the way, which you actually don't get a claim on, annoyingly enough. During the war with Russia, Persia also started a war of their own in Afghanistan, which I will take over just to add an extra war goal. It's small, but I'll be making Chitral a protectorate just because I can and it's a tiny infamy cost. Around the same time as Kabul's capitulation, the Russians also capitulated. Unfortunately, when I added the war goal for Bessarabia, I gave it to Serbia by accident. I did a similar thing with Piedmont in my Burgundy video, and I mean, you hate to see it, but it's not really a big deal. Regardless, it's time to ban slavery because the slavery movement's support is below 5%. I was running into some infrastructure issues by this point, so I got started on my steel and engine supply, after which I got railways up. As a quick overview of the empire, by the way, here's my current market, as of 1871. It's quite an expansive empire if you ask me, and it's not bad, although certainly a more aggressive Ottoman empire could go much further. I'm hoping to maybe pull some Persian pops into my states, but again, migration within a market is based on cultural communities and those spawn randomly, so we'll have to get lucky to get more pops migrating in. I can still build in my subjects nonetheless, but it's something I'll soon have to do as I'm beginning to run out of pops. I've been having a lot of back and forth on the slavery law here, unfortunately. I'm on the last phase with a 28% chance to finish as of April of 1873, at which point it finally passed, but it took 3 years for a law with 100-day phases. It is what it is. Just before the law passed, I made Persia a puppet, which would give me a pretty nice boost to my income, while also stopping Persia from further expansions. Nonetheless, the remaining powers in Central Asia are very weak and unrecognized, so I can just conquer them myself. In theory, we want to hold on to any of this land ourselves because we can use the pops there to make more jobs. I'm going to conquer Central Asia and grant it to Persia just for the aesthetics. I do wish that granting land to subjects could do something like slightly reducing infamy maybe, or maybe if you could conquer a state for a subject instead of for yourself, and apply infamy reduction if the state has a homeland culture in common with that subject maybe. But oh well, how can we expect such nuance from Victoria III after all? Against Bukhara, Russia decided to stand up, and that actually gives me the opportunity to press Persia's claim on Khwarezmia, which Russia controls a tiny piece of. To get Russia out of the war, I'll be doing the Kola strat, and getting into St. Petersburg pretty easily. At this point though, I also can just defeat Russia by pushing on that front, as my army is superior to theirs by now. Russia capitulated in August of 1875, and I was actually at risk of capitulating to Bukhara because their war goal was to revoke a claim on their capital, and I had mostly ignored that front to focus on Russia. Thankfully though, I was able to push in before I got capitulated and win the war. I granted all those new states to Persia after a brief revolt in Korea. For my next law change, by the way, I'm going for a cultural exclusion, and this is actually a pretty important change. At cultural exclusion, even pops with the lowest possible tolerance level can work in government buildings. I've mentioned that I'm running out of pops, and that is true, but I do have quite a few pops in places like Bosnia and Bulgaria. The problem is that they're so discriminated that they can't run bureaucracies there, and hence I can't collect taxes. That means I'd rather not build there if possible. One way I can also help grow my empire is by trying to liberalize my own subjects. Egypt and Persia both are still on serfdom, so I'm going to demand they try to pass tenant farms. If they develop their country more, I could take more of their money through subject payments, so it works nicely for us both really. As of August of 1877, by the way, I'm exporting almost 4,000 units of opium to China. It takes almost 5,000 convoys to ship all that opium, and assuming that one convoy is one ship, that's almost 5,000 ships filled with opium arriving in Suzhou, ready to offload it into China for huge profits. We even have an almost equal price between our markets, with the final opium price in the Ottoman Empire being 45.7, while it's 47.6 in China. Not bad at all. The revenue on the route is calculated by taking the difference between the market's price of the good in the exporter's market against the importer's market and multiplying it by how many units are being sold. So 3.71k times 47.6 minus 45.7, which is 1.9, gets us 7.10k. Or rather, it gives 7.049, but there are probably numbers that are being rounded in the quantities which are skewing the value. Regardless, the point is that it's making pretty good money to sell opium in China, although we'd like China to get even more opium demand if possible. We can also just make opium even cheaper in our own market, which is what I'm doing when I build more plantations in Persia. I passed cultural exclusion in December of 1877 while invading Khiva, and at this point, I consider my nation quite well liberalized, although still backwards in its commitment to the monarchy. I've still got a couple more laws to pass, like compulsory primary school, which will give us access to more education institution investments. We're going to skip ahead a bit to when I started trying to become a republic, but before doing so, I'll report some stats. In May of 1880, I'm the second greatest power behind Britain, of course, and I've got the fourth highest GDP in the world with 67 million. It definitely could be higher if I micromanaged my production methods a bit more and turned on some labor-saving methods, but I'm being lazy and just waiting for tech for the achievement. My opium trade route is up to almost 5,000 units of opium and over 6,000 ships, although funnily enough, the trade revenue has gone down, since the price difference is small at just 1 pound of difference. Nonetheless, the trade route is good because it produces profits for the opium plantations themselves in my market. This trade route is at level 84, by the way, which is quite high. In games I've done in my own time, I've gotten trade routes to level 100, which is the maximum they can go to, but it's exceptionally hard to actually trade that much of a good profitably to another nation. In April of 1881, I got compulsory primary school, and next up is proportional taxation. It ended up taking quite a few years to pass because I just got super unlucky with my debates and stalls, but along the way, I went to war with Kokand and Qing supported them. That's actually quite unfortunate because while we're at war, Qing can occupy Suzhou, and if they do, then it'll temporarily break my trade routes. My economy isn't totally dependent on the opium trade by any means, but we might see some opium plantations suddenly suffer from massive losses in profit from this war. I have actually stacked enough positive modifiers that my chance to pass proportional taxation hit 100% by the way, which is crazy. After that, I defeated the Chinese and got their war reparations, which are pretty nice. I finally passed my new tax laws in June of 1887, after which I easily passed free trade in just a year. It's crazy how sometimes luck can make your laws take almost a decade to change, and other times they fly by. Regardless, my industrialists with 28% clout have a Republican in charge, and that means it's time. A glorious revolution is coming, and it will peacefully see the Sultan deposed and replaced with an elected president. In Turkey, the rise of a republic coincided with a rise in nationalism and a focus on Turkishness over Ottoman identity, which was generally pluralistic in nature. In this particular case, the Turkish Republic is following a similar path, but with a broader focus on the Turkish cultural sphere. The Ottoman Empire is powerful and worthy as the leader of all Turks, and in Persia, there has been significant Turkish cultural export, such that the Persians are almost like brothers to the Turks of this timeline. After all, the Qajar dynasty comes from a Turkic tribe originally anyway, so are they not Turks themselves who simply lost their identity? Debate over the importance of the Ottoman Sultan, whose Turkishness was often in question, flooded the Parliament of Constantinople. The Ottoman harem was often filled with Balkan women and foreigners, and although a little influx of foreign blood couldn't erase Turkish identity, the Sultan, Ahmet Osmanoğlu, grew up in a palace with little connection to the Turkish identity. Support for the Republic flourished during these debates, with an 88% success chance for the establishment of a republic, showing that the Sultan's time is limited. In January of 1892, the Ottoman economy is going strong, and the country continues to prosper, with Turkish Republicans preaching the great work ethic of the Turkic people as the reason behind their successes, while the Ottoman Sultan argues that it's his leadership of the country creating prosperity. After all, it was the Ottoman lineage that brought about the liberalization of the nation and the creation of public school programs. The liberalization of the economy, though, acted as evidence that with less oversight, the Turkish people would better thrive. In particular, a group of Turkish doctors and surgeons pooled their research and discovered a way to defeat even the most virulent of bacterial disease. In 1891, Turkish doctors invented what they called antibiotics, which they gave a Latin name because of their higher education. To the monarchist wing of the government, the success could be contributed to the wise leadership of a sultan that had the right priorities when he implemented public education, and to the Republican nationalists, it was to the unique intelligence and grandeur of the Turkish spirit that the success could be credited. Nonetheless, these antibiotics would allow the nation's healthcare to reach new peaks, as antibiotics were rolled out to the various hospitals and clinics of the empire. In July of 1892, a new constitution, which formally demoted the Sultan in authority to a place below the Prime Minister, was drafted and poured over by the Ottoman officials to determine if there were any loopholes or issues with it. The parliament voted to accept the constitution and formally remove the Sultan from power. In the constitution, a new line was added near the end of the drafting period, where the Republicans insisted that the nation be renamed to Turkey, viewing the Ottoman epithet as outdated. The parliament voted to pass the new Turkish constitution, which saw the Sultan removed from power and replaced by its first president, Abdülhamid Timur. The Turkish Republic is here, despite the protests of the monarchists in western Turkey. The Republic found itself at war with Russia, but without any worry. The people of Turkey are ready for war, and ready to prove their supremacy to their Slavic neighbors for nothing more than ego. The war is over the conquest of Circassia, which is a British subject for no real reason beyond being a menace for Russia. In the early 1800s and late 1700s, the Russians were often a thorn in the Ottoman political landscape, and it's about time that the tables be turned. In return for support against Russia, Turkey has asked Britain to add in their list of demands that Kazakhstan, a rightfully Turkish nation, be freed. The British were happy to do so. Nonetheless, the nascent Turkish Republic has grand ambitions. The real motivation for this war is to have the Turkish officers study British tactics in Russia. There are plans to take away the British Empire's dominant position from the world brewing in the Turkish cabinet, but it must be done wisely. The British are no joke. Turkish officers spend time talking with British officers and admirals. They got along quite well, really, but there was some apprehension around the recent Republican Revolution. After all, the Turkish Republic and its proclamation would send waves throughout the monarchies of Europe, which might get some aspirational ideas of their own. Regardless, the war came to an end in November of 1894, and Kazakhstan was free. After the war, the Turkish cabinet voted to abolish the Qajar monarchy, whose existence was nothing more than a dividing bloc between Turkish and Persian identity. Persia and Turkey were united into one nation. If I could, I'd rename the country to reflect the dual Perso-Turkish identity, but we can't rename nations. What would you call this country? I'd probably call it Turan or something, but that's kind of generic. I'd love to hear some ideas. From here, I'm going to focus a bit back on the game. In case it wasn't obvious, when we researched antibiotics, we immediately put our healthcare up to level 5, but to get the Healthy Man of Europe achievement, we'll need to become the #1 great power. There are a couple different ways to do that, but they all revolve around prestige, of course. To be quite frank, I took the lazy way out. I'm just gonna make like 300 flotillas of ironclads and surpass Britain in prestige through naval power projection. Britain's got 276 flotillas, but they've also got all of India and a pretty big army. Now, to be clear, it is absolutely possible to outclass Britain with just a massive navy and get to #1 great power through ships alone, but I do intend to actually break down Britain to at least some extent this run. Also, I changed the color and name of my power block to better reflect this new identity. It's no longer the Devlet Aliya, and instead it's just Turan. To help with my mission to beat Britain's prestige, I created the Chemin de Fer Orientaux, or the Oriental Railway, which has a prosperity bonus that gives an extra 10% prestige. In May of 1898, my prestige was just under 3,000, as I had built up almost 300 flotillas, while Britain was at 3,208. Doing some quick math, the 10% bonus from the company will indeed push me over to first place, and that is indeed exactly what happened right after, as I hit first place. The achievement won't fire because I already have it, but this is indeed a complete Healthy Man of Europe. I am the Ottoman Empire, although now Turkey. I have a maxed out healthcare institution, and I'm the #1 great power. Shortly after unpausing, I was demoted to 2nd place because Britain regained some prestige from something. I don't know what exactly, but I'd like to completely secure my place at the top great power, so I'll be destroying Britain. Britain is currently in 3 other wars, so now is a great opportunity to invade. I also use this as an opportunity to test something. You know how when you free the British Raj, they fracture into a bunch of different princely states? Well, I was curious about how it works if you transfer a princely state and then the Raj fractures. Can the land that gets split up potentially go to a princely state that is a subject to someone else? If so, that would be free land, and it could potentially be a very strong strategy for taking over India without taking too much infamy. I'll be liberating the Raj in this war, and transferring Hyderabad, Baroda, and Bikaner to test out my theory. Alongside that, my primary war goal is to regime change Britain, because I think eradicating their monarchy is kind of funny. I'll also be liberating Ireland and conquering the Ionian Islands, since they're there. Honestly, 16 infamy for those entirely pointless islands is a total ripoff, but I want cleaner borders, so we'll do it. Presiding over this war will be the newly elected president Abdullah Engineri of the Rural Folk, known for his ruthlessness. This guy must have been one of the many revolutionaries that overthrew the Sultan. Anyway, conveniently, Britain is already in some dire straits, as they've been occupied already in another war. I guess I don't even need to cut down Britain, because the other great powers of the world are kind of handling it for me. Nonetheless, I landed in Ireland and set my troops on the front on the Raj for a proper 2-front war. The British did try to land in Istanbul, but I sent some units back to defend and put a portion of my navy in the Aegean to protect my coasts. The rest of the navy is sinking convoys in the English Channel to disrupt the British economy. In December of 1899, whatever other war Britain was in that was occupying London ended, which allowed me to start a naval invasion there to hopefully end this war, as the costs of this massive navy and armor were quickly adding up. To be fair, my interest rate is quite low, so it's okay to go into debt, but with over £500,000 in deficit each week, we'll surely begin defaulting relatively soon. The front in England was moving quite slowly, as the British had trench infantry. I had about equivalent military tech to the British, but trench infantry, as you'd expect, slow wars down significantly because of their huge defensive advantage. I'll eventually kill off the entire British manpower pool, given how little they have compared to me, but I'd rather not spend that much time. I'm instead hoping that my naval invasions into London will eventually land. We can see in September 1900, by the way, the havoc of my convoy raiding. Britain's subjects are totally isolated from the market, which will spike their liberty desire and harm their economies. If I had multiculturalism on, we'd likely see tons of mass migrations from these British subjects, as their people are escaping poverty, which I'm putting them in, but alas, they cannot mass migrate to a place where they would be more discriminated than they already are. Hence, we can probably expect the United States to be eating up a ton of immigration right now. I did eventually make it into London, but I realized that my war goals to transfer those princely states can only be enforced if I get the capital of India, which is West Bengal. I made a landing over there after a relatively light effort, and then, finally, Britain entered the negatives in war support. The war came to an end in December of 1901, and my theory proved to be correct. Hyderabad and Baroda both gained a bunch of land in India, all for free when the EIC fractured, meaning it would be quite wise for you, if you ever liberate the Raj, to grab a couple princes for yourself. I don't know how to determine which princes will get what land, so I guess it's a random roll, but if you get lucky, you get lucky, I suppose. The British Republic has now just a little over 1,000 prestige and is the 2nd place great power still, but significantly further behind me with my almost 4,000 prestige. This, for me, would mark the end of the run, as if I hadn't already gotten healthy man of Europe before when I first became the top great power, I'd surely have gotten it now. Again, I already have the achievement from a previous guide for an old patch, so it won't actually pop up for me, but rest assured these are the requirements. I ended the run in 1902, just to let the dust settle a little bit, and now we see that this is my glorious Turkish Republic, my Turan. Kazakhstan is in the power bloc, although they lost somehow some land to Russia, which I didn't notice until too late, I guess. We could go about cutting down more great powers and maybe even conquering old Ottoman land in Morocco, Algeria, Hungary, and Crimea, but I'm good. The game is getting laggy, and I'd rather move on to other things. I gotta say, the deep Turkish red for the power block is very pretty. I hope you found this guide helpful, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for your time.